I've just come back from Dubai in Buenos Aires, and just as the temperature can plummet from 30 degrees to 10 degrees coming back home, so too can an economic performance of a country really plummet if you get tax reform wrong or you get tax policy wrong. And I was struck in Argentina by one of the greatest absurdities in the tax system one cannot really imagine, and that is that an economy which is short of foreign exchange reserves, has a hugely overvalued exchange rate, and it puts a tax on exports. Now, we may not have quite as crazy a system in the UK, but it does go towards proving one fairly essential point, which is that tax matters. It really does matter. Now, historically, looking at the impact of tax on economic performance, both at the micro level and then aggregating up at the macro level, certainly at the macro level, it's been a difficult debate. If you look back at the 1980s, actually at that time, when there was a sort of Thatcher-Reagan revolution, as we might determine it, that actually wasn't built on any sort of robust economic analysis. If you look at the economic analysis which are around then, most of it actually said there wasn't a negative impact on taxation. Most of them said that the impact on labour supply of high taxation wasn't that strong. I believe that debate has moved on a huge amount since then. And what the single income tax study shows is just the sheer volume and weight of evidence now, both at the microeconomic level and the macroeconomic level, of the negative consequences on economic performance of an excessive state, and in particular an excessive tax system. And I think in the past, one of the reasons that a lot of the arguments which are contained in the report have been dismissed is what I call the marginal problem. And that is quite simply that the evidence base in part wasn't there because nobody had done the tax reform to show it. If you look at the 80s, we talked about, the Lawson tax cuts. But outside there, you had a very significant change in the marginal rate for one cohort, or one grouping there. But traditionally, in the post-war period, whenever taxes changed, it was by a relatively marginal allowance. It was 1p off income tax plucked out the hat at the end of the budget. It's not going to fundamentally change performance. But where you have examples of significant changes in marginal rates, then you do have a much stronger evidence base there. But on top of that as well, I think over recent years, has been I wouldn't say an explosion, but a rapid increase in the number of studies showing at the macroeconomic level as well, a robust relationship. Unfortunately, a robust negative relationship, which is saying that higher taxation does lead to a reduced economic performance. There's a study in recent years which summarised all the literature in addition to the single income tax study, and that came to the conclusion, roughly, as the TPA report, which is that if you've got a roughly 10 percentage points of GDP in the burden of taxation, i.e. let's say from 35 to 45%, then that probably on average leads to a loss or reduction of 0.5 percentage points off the growth rate, i.e. from 2.5 to 2. And there are quite a number of studies which suggest it could be even higher, up to 1% or more as well. Now, these may not seem very significant numbers. They may not seem very large, but I'll remind you the most powerful force in the universe, which is compound arithmetic. And that is quite simply that cumulatively over time, it makes a very big difference. It makes a huge difference. If you look at an economy over a period of working life, if somebody starts work today and retires in 40 years' time, there is and you've got a sort of 1% growth rate over that period compared with, let's say, a 3% growth rate. That's a difference between an economy growing, it's a doubling, it's about 226%, I think we've quoted the final number there, over a 40-year period. If you get this policy wrong, it has consequences. But it's not just the burden of taxation in terms of the overall level and the marginal rates there, it's the complexity of the system, which is also a problem in the UK. The complexity undermines and actually compounds the existing rate problem and the overall burden. So it's not just a case of looking at a number and saying that's the end of the story. Far from it. The nature of the tax system itself will undermine an impact on economic performance. And if you look at how these effects compound each other, then look at the increase in the complexity of the tax system in the UK over recent years. It's quite absurd, actually, when you look at just marginal rates, where you've got, I was brought up in North Wales, and the marginal rate structure looks like a castle wall, a medieval castle wall, because it's up, down, now. You go from the top, you go from 40% basically to a 60% marginal rate, excluding NIFX, between 100 and 120,000 roughly, because of the withdrawal of the personal allowance. Then it falls back again, then it goes back up again to 45%, and it was 50%. And we have the absurdity as well that recently, well, obviously it came to effect the reduction in the top rate back to 45%. But when you look at the HMRC analysis there, HMRC analysis basically says there is little or no revenue loss from reducing from 50 to 45. But then it says that also there's only a couple of 100 million loss from potentially going down from 45 to 40, which is quite absurd that we retain this structure purely and simply for political reasons. There is no economic case there in HMRC's own evidence for the 45, let alone the 50% rate, and yet we continue with it for political reasons. And that's just absurd. It's not quite as absurd as a tax on exports, but it is absurd nevertheless. And I'd flip back to saying, I was in Buenos Aires, but I was also in Dubai the week before, and there you see the consequences of a much simpler, flatter, much reduced tax system. In fact, the burden there is so low that you can see the dynamic impacts, not the sole impact on economic performance, but a huge contributing factor, and one which, if you get it right, if you get infrastructure policy right, if you get the supply side right, and you get the right tax structure and you get the right regulatory structure, then you can unleash the private sector. I do not believe at the present time the tax system in the UK provides a supply side base for liberating the private sector, and that's exactly what we want to do. We want to see a reduction in the burden of taxation, reduction in the complexity of taxation, and what we set out there is a flat rate system which would work, which would also enable the abolition of a whole range of taxes, which Matthew's going to talk about, which would work if you had the political courage to implement it. Now, there are complications there. You need to get the public spending burden down in order to deal with some of the winners and losers issues. So you do need a much reformed, much smaller state. But we have no doubt whatsoever that if you began to go down that road would lead to something much closer to Dubai than Buenos Aires. Thank you very much.